A lot of folks are familiar with the inner workings of Scientology. There have been a lot of great exposés into the group, like Going Clear, the documentary by Alex Gibney, or Leah Remini's show Scientology and the Aftermath. There are a mangled handful of marquee names who are associated still with Scientology, which keeps the shrinking group in the public eye. Celebs with a connection to Scientology are slowly being lost to the ceaseless attrition of time, and there are very few second-gen celebs of any renown outside of Elizabeth Moss, and even less now that Danny Masterson is doing life in jail. NXIVM, in many ways, has always been the puke-faced little brother, the little kid sibling of Scientology, in my mind. The parallels have been remarked on as long as NXIVM has been covered in the mainstream press. In the 2003 Forbes cover story, Cult of Personality, there was a comparison to Scientology as well as a comparison to the Landmark Forum, or EST, by Werner Erhard, which is another executive training type MLM type high control group hybrid, very similar to NXIVM, but from the West Coast. The following passage outlined the parallels between the groups and NXIVM and also provides a characteristically vivid imagery as a story subject, which has always been, in my mind, one of the major hallmarks of NXIVM and Keith Raniere, and one of the reasons why they end up in the news so often is because they make for such great copy. Even as I am researching this little tiny corner of the story, looking into comparisons between, say, NXIVM and Scientology, there's just geysers of material out there. There's too much material in this case. There's just so much to this story that has been barely addressed or understood by the public at large, in my opinion. So hence this video series. So quoting from the 2003 Forbes cover story, Cult of Personality, on comparisons between NXIVM and Scientology, executive success resembles motivational groups such as the Landmark Forum. It is also reminiscent of the human potential training of the 1970s, with a few Scientology-like elements and parallels to EST, the much-criticized groupthink program founded by Werner Erhard. Unlike EST, which famously discouraged students from using the bathroom during sessions, executive success offers plenty of breaks. At the time, I should mention, NXIVM was referred to as Executive Success Programs, aka ESP, so it had a very similar name to Werner Erhard's EST, which is another reason why it invited the comparison. Executive Success offers plenty of breaks. Students pay up to $10,000 for 5 days of lectures and intense emotional probing in daily 13-hour cram sessions. They remove their shoes for class, learn obscure handshakes, and wear patented colored sashes in dozens of different variations that signify rank in the organization. When a higher-ranking student enters the room, they must stand to show respect. They are taught to bow to one another and to vanguard. When he makes a rare appearance, Elvis-like, students rush up to him. Some ex-clients say they have seen him greet each woman with a kiss on the mouth, although Raniere denies this. This is really interesting to read because, of course, Raniere, like in The Vow, does kiss everybody on the mouth. So it's funny that his story apparently changed about kissing on the mouth over the years, or at least I guess he couldn't deny it anymore after a certain point. But this is, of course, a 2003 story, so this is like one of the first big stories about Raniere in the mainstream press. And the whole, we're going to get so much more into this story over the years, but there's a lot more that's very interesting about the way that this story was written, the 2003 Forbes cover story. But to finish the quote here, once a day the attendees recite a 12-point mission statement written by Raniere. Sample, there are no ultimate victims, therefore I will not choose to be a victim. It is apocalyptic in tone with occasional grammatical error, his genius notwithstanding. The world is full of people who try to destroy each other, steal from each other, down each other, or rejoice at another's demise. Thus, he writes, it is essential for the survival of humankind that the world's wealth and resources be controlled by successful, ethical people, i.e. those trained at executive success. The Forbes article then goes on to detail the eccentricities of the group and Keith in his insane biography, which has always invited curiosity, derision, and comment. I mean, Have you ever seen his biography? It's nuts. All the crazy claims he makes, like the high IQ and the East Coast judo champion at age 11, and on and on and on. So back in 2018, a writer going by the handle John P. Capitalist wrote a post that went up on the old Frank report that compares NXIVM and Scientology, and it's a great resource as John outlines a number of major areas of overlap between the two organizations. This post was such a quality post that it even attracted the attention of Dr. Stephen Kent, who's a well-known researcher in the field of new religious movements. And Dr. Kent has a long-standing expertise in Scientology, especially. A few years after the blog post in 2018, in 2021, Dr. Kent wrote an article in a special edition of the International Journal of Coercion, Abuse, and Manipulation called Comparative Reflections on Scientology and NXIVM, which quoted John P. Capitalist's post at length and commented on the categories of overlap, as well as adding his own takes and some thoughts on important differences between the groups as well. The categories that John P. Capitalist, which is obviously a pen name, saw overlap between the groups in his article are the following. Here I'm going to quote at some length with my comments from John P. Capitalist's article and on the different categories that he saw in common between NXIVM and Scientology. The first main category that invites comparison is litigation. I think this is an obvious place to start. In the post, he points out that Keith Raniere uses the same scorched earth litigation tactics against his opponents that Scientology does. One critic website suggests that Raniere may have spent as much as $50 million in legal fees over the last 20 years with little to show for it. I think that might actually be underselling it, which we'll definitely see the dollar figures in much greater depth as we proceed forward in this series of videos. But just to give you an idea of the scale of how much money we're talking about for NXIVM, it was definitely in the tens of millions. Raniere spent 14 years, for example, suing well-known anti-cult activist Rick Ross in a case which collapsed after Raniere was arrested and later convicted and sentenced to over 100 years in jail. So Raniere also sued journalists that were exposing him, and they also tried to have a lot of different people arrested, including Sarah Edmondson, one of the main people behind The Vow, and the whistleblower that appeared in the New York Times on the cover with her brand with Keith Raniere's initials on her hip. So litigation is the first area of overlap. I think that's a pretty good one. Second area of overlap between the two is the fabricated background. And in the article, John P. Capitalist points out that Raniere's background is just as fabricated as L. Ron Hubbard's, given the wild claims that Raniere has in his autobiography, which have been chronicled at length in other places. But, third greatest problem solver in the world, IQ in, 240, all these different insane claims in his biography. And there's a lot of very clear overlap with L. Ron Hubbard, who also had all sorts of exaggerated claims, very similar and interesting, actually, looking at what they chose to sort of highlight in their own CVs. For example, you have L. Ron Hubbard claiming to have been the youngest ever Eagle Scout, and Keith Raniere claiming to have been the youngest East Coast judo champ. And I think both of them were claiming to have both been around 11 years old or so. Sort of odd. And then, L. Ron Hubbard also had a lot of other really weird, colorful things in his biography, including that he was a blood brother to the Blackfeet Native American tribe at age 4. Just weird stuff like that on its face is pretty ludicrous. I always think it's sort of interesting that these sort of claims are accepted by their followers on some level, or at least there's some sort of interesting self-selection or filtering going on there where you kind of have to be the sort of person, I guess, that will take a claim like that on faith to be a follower of one of these gentlemen, I guess. So lots of interesting comparison there in the area of fabricated background. The third area of overlap explored in this article is secrecy of the tech. It's also a really interesting one because NXIVM materials have, they've attempted to subject them to extraordinary secrecy just like Scientology. In fact, there's a whole long early internet history on the alt.religion Scientology message boards in the 90s. Some of these early lawsuits ended up becoming important for internet freedom of speech and web hosting, that sort of stuff. NXIVM students also sign extensive non-disclosure agreements, and the article also points out that the members of the inner circle in NXIVM give over collateral, which is supposed to be explicitly intended to be used against them leaving. The fourth area of overlap suggested in this article is obsession with ethics. This one's also really interesting in that it sort of tells you a lot about what preoccupied the founders, L. Ron Hubbard and Keith Raniere, and I guess one expression that could be used to describe what might be going on there is that they were projecting their own feelings of needing to control ethics onto the world, I guess, would be one way of looking at it. But Raniere follows the same playbook in Scientology as other cults, claiming to be like the most ethical guy on the planet, which is a common in cults, which is pointed out in this article by John P. Capitalist for engendering feelings of superiority in members. One thing that I always think about with cults is that, you know, with all human groups, there's always like a big focus on the in-group and the out-group, right? That's a very important distinction and something that's sort of hardwired into human behavior. And so, you know, if you have a playbook that sets out this very stringent level of ethics, then it's a very sort of obvious tool to make people inside the group feel superior to people outside the group, which is pointed out in this article. And then, so the next area that they discuss in the article is the expansion from core self-help into other areas. And there's just so many, it's so interesting to think about like why groups choose to start certain front organizations or decide to go in certain directions. Like when you look at stuff like the Rainbow Cultural Garden that was started by NXIVM, which was like this crazy daycare type thing where there was like all these nannies supposedly teaching these kids all these different languages at very young ages, and it was just like this like super pie in the sky like Montessori on steroids type concept. And the other thing is that, you know, these groups always sort of need to be expanding. Like Scientology, they give examples of them expanding into other front groups involving like study tech, trying to get involved with schools that way, and also drug rehab like Narconon. There's a suggestion in this piece about like the principles behind the language immersion approach and how it sort of has like an interesting mirror in Scientology, which has their own idiotic attempts to treat reading problems with their study tech. Sort of insane that Scientology is like, oh, all those people in, you know, the poor part of the city don't know how to read. I know what'll help them. Let's give them some good old LRH study tech. You know, those people in the ghetto, let's hand them a copy of Dianetics, and I'm sure that'll right what's wrong, right? Yeah, that's what they really think, though, I guess. Anyway, the last category of comparison and overlap is blatant disregard for basic human rights. And in this section, the article touches on a number of like unregulated experiments that both groups have gotten into, including like NXIVM doing studies on members' brain activities without any sort of scientific basis or controls, and then all the sort of quack research that L. Ron Hubbard got into in Scientology, which is numerous and well chronicled elsewhere. The article really interestingly suggests that these experiments may have actually been designed to figure out what sort of stimuli would make members more likely to sign up for additional courses, so that there's some sort of form of like, again, self-selection or A and B testing going on here with these programs. So anyway, the rest of this article is really well worth reading, and at the end of it, John goes over his thoughts on the long-term prognosis for both NXIVM and Scientology. I thought this was one of the most fun and interesting parts of the article, because again, remember, this was written in like 2018, which is sort of at an interesting point for NXIVM, given that it was during Keith Raniere's trial. He hadn't been convicted yet. And then it was also right at an interesting point for Scientology, because 2018 was about, I think, a year or so after it had been reported that police in Los Angeles were investigating Danny Masterson, and Danny Masterson hadn't been convicted yet either. So it's interesting to look back on John P. Capitalist's prediction and prognosis for both the long-term health of both NXIVM and Scientology. Just to give you a sort of quick thumbnail, John predicted that NXIVM would fall apart quickly with Keith in jail, which has proven to, I think, be pretty accurate. There's barely a handful of loyalists still online that are apparently still following, and even dead enders like Nikki Klein have left at this point. So I think that makes, his diagnostic there accurate. And then he also talks about how he thinks that Scientology will be a lot more intractable. It'll be a lot more resilient, in which it has apparently been. But John also describes what he calls exogenous shocks or unpredictable events from outside, which he predicts will continue to damage Scientology. And he outlines, it's in essence both like a gradual and a sudden decline scenario for Scientology, which is fun to read. But it was interesting because it's almost like the Masterson conviction is like a perfect example of what he was talking about with his concept of an exogenous shock or an unpredictable outside event which damages the cult, which causes all sorts of second and third order effects. So yeah, that's just really interesting reading that from like a really analytical mind. Yeah, so then the journal article by Dr. Kent takes this blog post as sort of like it's raw material and sort of makes it into a lot more of a carefully constructed compare and contrast between NXIVM and Scientology. This is just like a really interesting baseline and I think an instructive way into the series of videos that I want to do next about NXIVM. And I think one of the reasons why I want to start here in comparing NXIVM with Scientology is that a lot more people, like I said, are like familiar with Scientology. That world, more people have had some exposure to. Less people understand NXIVM, but it also has had a lot of pub. It's had the Vow documentary series. It's been reported on websites like the Frank Report. But one of the reasons why I wanted to make this is that I think that a lot of the material out there on NXIVM is just, is flawed in a lot of ways. And just to give you an example, like from my opinion, the Vow series has some amazing footage. It's a great, compelling, amazing, rewatchable, bingeable, great series. But it's also flawed because it comes from a perspective of Mark Vicente and Sarah Edmondson, who were like two of the top lieutenants, two of the people that probably made out financially probably the best out of the whole NXIVM thing. And they got to be like the head of this whole doc series. They ended up suing a lot of the former members after they left, even though they recruited a bunch of them in the first place. Remember, Sarah Edmondson was like the biggest recruiter. She recruited, I believe, over 2,000 people into NXIVM. So anyway, that's what I'm saying, is that the perspective, the POV of the Vow comes from a really awkward place. And, as opposed to like if it came to like a member with like less, unclean hands, I think it would have been a totally different documentary, because in my opinion, like a lot of the first season is done in such a way as to show you, it almost be like a mini cult indoctrination of its own. A lot of people have commented on that it sort of justifies and is like a slow drip into the world of NXIVM, to where by like the last, some of the revelations in the last couple episodes of season 1, people are like, well, if I would have known that right away, that would have totally colored everything. I guess that's sort of the point on one level, but that's just what I'm saying, is that there's just room for other perspectives. So that's why I think this video series is going to be so interesting, and why I think this makes a lot of sense to start here in this really interesting article that compares NXIVM and Scientology. And it's really interesting to hear, on top of this blogger John P. Capitalist's thoughts, the refined thoughts of Dr. Stephen Kent. And this guy is like one of the leading experts in new religious movements and cults. So I'm just going to go over some of Dr. Kent's points on these different categories. And one of the things, like the notes of caution that he sounds right away as he's getting into categorizing these areas of overlap, is that there's also really important differences between NXIVM and Scientology, and those differences are maybe even more important in some ways than the overlap, but they are, they really go together as like sort of a match set, and that's sort of the whole idea behind it. Compare and contrast is you can sort of size something up a lot better when you can see all the things that are alike of the two organizations, and then in contrast also see the things that are different. And it gives like a really interesting relief in terms of the perspective of seeing one and then the other. So that contrast is really important. And Dr. Kent points that out at the beginning of this article and emphasizes that one of the first things that he mentions that's like an important difference to consider is that Scientology is a religious organization legally and is therefore tax exempt. NXIVM never attempted to become a religion. And it's been commented elsewhere, I can't remember exactly where I'm thinking of this quote from, but other people have said that like one of the biggest mistakes that Keith Raniere made was not trying to make NXIVM a religion, and that it may have been his biggest mistake in terms of like organizational structure and design. I mean, he made a lot of mistakes other than that, like starting a crazy sex cult would be number one on the list, right? But I mean, just saying in terms of like, the way that he set it up, it was sort of really foolish of him to have it be like a business or MLM thing. And whereas, Scientology famously is tax exempt.
One of the things he didn't do, which was great that he didn't do, is he didn't make this, NXIVM wasn't a religion. It was a religion, but he didn't call it a religion. Whereas, JW, Scientology are religions, so they have all this protection. And that's unfortunate because, yes, it's true. They can't be touched yet. I think that's coming. And in his case, I think he lived in a world of delusion where, because he spent so much time in one place protected from society, the only interaction he had with society was anybody coming in to the organization and then stuff he would, see on the internet. So I think he really believed he would get away with it forever. I remember a conversation I had with him right before I left. I said, I don't know what's going on, but whatever you're doing, it's going to blow up. Something's not right here, And he said to me, well, I don't think it's going to blow up. Maybe other things, but not this. And I didn't know what this was at that point.
Dr. Kent then points out another big difference is that Raniere and 5 close associates of his had just been convicted of various racketeering and trafficking offenses. So Dr. Kent wrote this journal article in 2021, so it was like a couple years after Raniere had been convicted. And he points that out as an important difference to consider just because of like the legal nature of the fact that Raniere is convicted and a felon, and L. Ron Hubbard was never convicted of anything, although he was an unindicted co-conspirator in a number of charges that were laid and people that were convicted in Hubbard's inner circle in the 70s. Anyway, but LRH was never actually convicted. Dr. Kent also points out that LRH, L. Ron Hubbard, didn't appear to be personally involved in trafficking women for his own sexual gratification, whereas that was like a big thing, a huge part of what NXIVM and Keith Raniere were all about. Dr. Kent mentions that does mention that like in 2009 there was like a big FBI investigation of Scientology that almost resulted in a raid on a Scientology base. And he gets into this, but it's like important to remember this is well after L. Ron Hubbard had been dead. But I mean, just in terms of comparing the two organizations, there was a lot of alleged trafficking in that time period and still to this day, and lots of allegations and litigation involving forced labor and other trafficking type offenses have been levied by former members of especially the C organization, which is the interpriestly class of Scientology. And this is important to contrast, Dr. Kent illustrates, because there's been some similar litigation with ex-members and NXIVM, and one of the main things that's contrasted in the actual legal filings is the fact that Scientology uses a lot of like religious freedom exemptions, First Amendment exemptions to get away with its abuses, whereas NXIVM doesn't have that foothold. Dr. Kent also points out that Alice and Mack's attorneys at one point tried to cite aspects of the 2009 Scientology litigation where they almost raided a base to get the indictment against Mack thrown out. They tried to use a similar argument that Scientology had used, but Mack ultimately ended up pleading guilty, so it was a moot point, and that litigation never went forward. Dr. Kent then cited the work of another researcher also writing in the same journal named Susan Rain. And Susan Rain had a really interesting framework which she applied to describe how organizations like NXIVM work. She refers to them as a reinventive institution that will promise transformative technologies for self-improvement, but which developed totalistic practices that trapped a lot of its members in systems of self and organizational harm. So yeah, and NXIVM had a public presentation and claims that it was a reinventive institution, and it paralleled Scientology's own claim that it is the purpose of Scientology is to make the able more able. Dr. Kent then describes a survey of the literature of extant examples of former members of NXIVM referring to Keith and his knowledge of Scientology, which is only like a handful of, there's only like 3 of them, it sounds like. The first is Toni Natalie, who is an early girlfriend of Raniere during the first generation of NXIVM, and she said that Keith had a copy of Dianetics in 1999 when she was working with Keith and Nancy Salzman. And Nancy Salzman is, of course, the neuro-linguistic programming expert and the number 2, aka prefect, at NXIVM. Then we also get a quote from Heidi Hutchinson, who's a sister of a woman named Gina Hutchinson, who was Keith's girlfriend in the late 80s. Heidi was a lead singer in a band at the time, and her agent, she said, paid for her to take Scientology courses, and then she helped Keith get some materials from Scientology via Keith's girlfriend, her sister at the time, but she didn't really have any other information other than to say that Keith was really interested. He was fascinated with Scientology in her recollection in the 80s. And then the one other notable comment that was listed is, an important counterweight is the testimony of Mark Vicente. In an interview, Vicente mentioned that he said, and this is actually much later than Heidi and Tony, so it's important to think like this is at a different point in NXIVM's life cycle, but Vicente said that he thought his tech was better than Scientology's. Of course, right? I mean, of course he's going to be like NXIVM's way better than Scientology. But this is what Mark Vicente said. He said, I actually heard him talk negatively about Scientology. He would say that the auditing process actually disassociates people, which I thought was very funny because in essence, a lot of the processes that were used in NXIVM did exactly that. They disassociated people from different things that they were reacting to. But no, he never spoke about how he got ideas from there. Now, there are people that knew him that said that he actually studied Scientology extensively, but I'd never seen any L. Ron Hubbard books, and mostly what he said about Scientology was that it was not as effective as what he was doing in NXIVM and wasn't very good for people. That was his basic story. Then Kent offers this context to Vicente's remarks, which is that Vicente spent hundreds, if not thousands, of hours with Raniere, so his remarks carry weight. They indicate that Raniere apparently had evaluated at least some of Scientology's auditing techniques, but so many of them exist that we cannot know which one or ones served as the basis of his criticism. The fact that Vicente did not recall seeing any Scientology books in Raniere's possession is interesting, but his report that Raniere believed more in the effectiveness of his own techniques is to be expected, said Dr. Kent. Kent also notes that the proposed jury questionnaire for Raniere's trial had a question about whether the potential jurors knew anyone close to them in Scientology or who had any experience in it. Kent then goes into each of the categories mentioned in John P. Capitalist's original article, adding his own commentary. For litigation as an area of overlap, Kent also suggested that John could have also mentioned that Rick Ross had been successfully sued by Scientology in a crazy lawsuit called the Cult Awareness Network case, where Scientology was able to take over an anti-cult organization after winning a lawsuit it funded against Ross. So Kent added that as another one to consider. And then he also suggested that another prime example that has to be cited in this category was, of course, Operation Freakout, which was an operation against journalist Paulette Cooper in the 70s that nearly imprisoned her for a fake letter bomb that they manufactured against Paulette through a crazy series of events that's chronicled in The Unbreakable Miss Lovely by Tony Ortega, a great book if you want to read more about Paulette, a pioneering reporter in the area of Scientology especially, and a Holocaust survivor as an infant, as detailed in the book. So yeah, I mean, this Operation Freakout was another one that he suggested that you have to add to the list, and of course it is like the prime example of fair gaming. A reporter nearly caused Paulette to attempt to self-delete. And then there's also a brief sidebar to the SP or suppressive persons terminology, which is also an overlap, but one where NXIVM obviously poached the concept whole cloth from L. Ron Hubbard. And so here's a quote from the article from Rick Ross, the well-known anti-cult activist. Suppressive person or group that has no rights of any kind was fair game, and any actions taken against them are not punishable. NXIVM critic Rick Ross said that when he first read Raniere's instructions about disconnections from suppressive persons, I realized he was copying from Scientology. The second category Kent commented on was how both L. Ron Hubbard and Raniere fabricated their backgrounds. This category, in my mind, is so rich and just ripe for analysis. Kent gets into how Keith puffed up his resume with all sorts of insanity, from overselling his education to all the childhood prodigy claims and IQ claims, which mapped very cleanly against Hubbard's embellished war record and made up educational credentials as well. In thinking about this, there's also another possible subcategory that I thought of, or additional classification that could be that both Keith and L. Ron Hubbard were well known for malingering, especially by their closest non-intimate associates. LRH would talk about, how he would go through this wall of fire, or, and that would cause him some great pain or something like that. How he'd walk through Christ-like to find the OT levels. And he also had this whole thing where he was injured at the end of World War II, and he embellished greatly what was wrong with him, where it was pink eye and the gout or something like that. And in reality, but he tried to say that he had been machine gunned in the back or some wild stuff like that. So yeah, it was just that typical type of fabrication. Keith would also blame his followers' lack of obedience for causing him physical pain or illness. So I thought that was a really interesting overlap that I wanted to comment on as well while I was thinking about it. And then the other category was the secrecy of the tech, which is again a very clear overlap between the two organizations. LRH was of course legendary for his hatred of what he called squirrels, or people who mess with the tech. Squirreling the tech is what he calls it, when somebody's using the tech in a non-standard bad way. Keith and LRH would both attack critics by suing them for republishing their copyrighted material. And I even found an old cultnews.com article from the early 2000s that suggested that NXIVM and Scientology were working together on this exact issue. Quoting from the article, in an ironic twist, a well-known Scientology operative, Nancy O'Meara, claimed that she is cooperating with NXIVM regarding its current New York litigation. I'm working on 2 cases right now where the Ross Institute is being sued for copyright trademark violation filed in July 2003, said O'Meara in an email dated August 22nd. It appears that Raniere is being coached by Scientology, arguably the most litigious cult in the world, and judging by his recent court setbacks, the man NXIVM devotees call Vanguard may be losing his edge by following in Scientology's dubious legal footsteps. So I thought that was a pretty fun find that I added to this. And then Kent also points out how NXIVM members would have to sign very extensive NDAs, and members of the inner circle would have to give up collateral. This is very similar to some aspects of the Scientology practice of auditing, where you have to tell your Scientology auditor or counselor all your inner secrets, or you are guilty of withholds or overts. The fourth area of overlap is obsession with ethics. And here the comparison I'd like to make is not between NXIVM and Scientology, but NXIVM and another woo philosophy that's been in the news and receiving a ton of scrutiny lately, and that's effective altruism, or EA. EA is about doing good better, according to their website, which I'm just sort of shocked at how it just seems very incurious to me that they wouldn't know that that's so similar to the Scientology, longtime Scientology making the able more able. That's there. It's almost like EA is infringing on Scientology's gimmick, but even more so on NXIVM, because I found this quote that was on the NXIVM's website, even back in 1998, that is quoted in Kent's paper, and I wanted to make this comparison to effective altruism, because this is what the in Raniere's 12-point mission statement that participants read at the beginning of the ESP program courses. Each individual pledged to, quote, to ethically control as much of the money, wealth, and resources of the world as possible within my success plan, unquote. Also stating that, quote, success, ethics, and integrity were co-inspirational, end quote. This was like, I thought I was reading like a copy and paste error or something. I mean, this is like exactly what EA says. It's just kind of shocking that it's like the same thing as NXIVM and also Scientology, but like dead on to what Keith Raniere wrote back in 1998. So I think people behind the EA philosophy might want to update their website, or at least think a little bit about, like, is that really the mission statement that you want to go with there? Doing good better? Especially after Sam Bankman-Fried. I mean, holy heck. That's the connection, by the way, is that Sam Bankman-Fried was a big booster of effective altruism and was supposedly a member of this group that pledges to donate all of their money to making the world better or something. Kent then also goes on to detail how in 2009, NXIVM and really the Bronfman sisters, Sarah and Claire, who we haven't even really talked about yet, how they got the Dalai Lama to come to Albany and meet with Keith Raniere for a day for a reported $1 million. And as part of like that whole dressing up the NXIVM organization, they started yet another front organization called the Ethical Science Foundation. And NXIVM and Raniere were like obsessed with using the term ethics, despite apparently being totally ignorant of how ethics really worked. I think Mark Vicente, again, in his statement at Raniere's sentencing, summed it up very well when he said, "He has belief that he is the next evolution of humankind, beyond worldly ethics and morality, far superior to this court. He thinks he breathes the rarefied air of an awakened genius. But he is none of these things. He is a malicious, petty, evil, and dangerously vengeful sociopath." So saith Mark Vicente. Then Kent gets into the conditions of ethics in Scientology and how LRH also had a hard-on for that concept, despite, again, being a sleazeball personally. You are out ethics in Scientologies. If you mess up in Scientology, in both Scientology and NXIVM, the ethics or ideas of the founder were seen as absolutely vital to the future of mankind. Kent then touches on the fifth area, expansion from core self-help claims into other areas. These are fascinating indicators to me because both Scientology and NXIVM have incredible mission creep. Both have these like wild laundry lists of related organizations and shell groups and fronts and on and on and on. Narcanon and Study Tech in Scientology, and then the Rainbow Cultural Garden program at NXIVM, where again they're trying to get kids to learn a bunch of languages, along with indoctrination into the cult. Kent then adds that both Raniere and Hubbard were so grandiose that they both tried to expand their influence into nation states. LRH tried to take over Rhodesia back in like the 60s before being tossed out of that country, as one example of the wild schemes of the old man, while Keith Raniere had his own attempt to create power within the Mexican government. Finally, we get blatant disregard for basic human rights as Category 6. There's like a billion examples of each of these, but Kent points out that LRH and Keith both did research involving human subjects without proper safeguards in place, and showed like a wanton lack of care for people involved in their cockamamie experiments, like the infamous Tourette study cooked up by Keith et al. To try to legitimize their tech. And then we hear about LRH in one of his experiments, which is an even more insane scenario where he developed a concept called the introspection rundown, which basically involved locking a crazy person experiencing a psychotic break in a room and then not allowing anybody to talk to them or interact with them until they snapped out of it. This is what got Lisa McPherson unalived. LRH was so taken with the introspection rundown, he thought that it was like a amazing discovery that would spell the end of shrinks. Get this quote from an LRH bulletin. "The strongest claim about treating psychotics appeared in a 1974 publication about Hubbard's discovery of something he supposedly developed in 1973 called the Introspection Rundown. In the second revision of the Introspection Rundown, Hubbard proclaimed, 'This means the last reason to have psychiatry around is gone,' all caps in original." After going over the main categories outlined in John P. Capitalist's piece, Kent offers some really fun potpourri at the end of the article. I've added a link, of course, in the description to a copy of this article if anyone wants to check it out. And I haven't even told you about the best part yet at all. You see, I discovered this journal article when I was looking into something totally different. And as I was getting towards the back half of this piece, I had a weird sort of sensation of deja vu. Like, I feel like I've read these passages before. This subject matter just seemed, eerily familiar. After discussing the hardcore inner circle facilitators who are necessary for any thriving cult, and how it's important to have wealthy benefactors, which both NXIVM and Scientology do, we got to a little category about spying on the cult's enemies. And then I saw this passage, and I was like, hey, I wrote that. And that's how I discovered that an article I wrote in 2020 for the Frank Report about that time that NXIVM attempted to groom the college a cappella community by creating, hosting, and fully funding 2 years of an a cappella festival was quoted extensively in an academic journal. It's a funny little story. I am really passionate about this whole area of the NXIVM lore, the NXIVM a cappella connection. The article that I wrote back in 2020, actually 2 of them on the a cappella stuff, and it ended up being a really interesting section in the heart of a journal article in the International Journal of Coercion, Abuse, and Manipulation, as I mentioned. And here I'm going to read you a little portion of it, the operative portion. Operation Snow White received mention in a discussion about a clumsy spy operation that NXIVM conducted against a powerful a cappella music organization that Raniere tried and failed to infiltrate. Raniere claimed to have musical skills and intellectual patents pending in the areas of voice and musical training, but his interest in a voice-only singing likely became aroused when he realized that people who participated in the a cappella performance and workshop community were, quote, were based around elite universities and were full of young, slightly nerdy musical theater types who would be a fertile hunting ground for a cult like NXIVM that specialized in charming wealthy philanthropists, scions of blue blood families, and seekers from groups like the acting and yoga communities. Helmar 2020. It's so funny to see your name quoted in an academic journal for such wacky subject as a cappella and cults. Well, it just amuses me to no end that a blog I wrote on the Frank Report ended up becoming an academic article. It just tickles me. I don't know why. Consequently, in 2007, NXIVM organized and completely funded an a cappella festival covering all participants' travel and accommodation expenses, and the influential head of the contemporary a cappella society, Deke, Sharon, attended. Mention of NXIVM throughout the festival was minimal, although some participants noted it nonetheless. But more obvious was that attendees were asked intrusive amounts of personal information like social security numbers, home addresses, and other contact information. Helmar 2020. With the beginning of the second festival in 2008, concerns about NXIVM's sponsorship erupted when somebody posted links on an influential a cappella internet forum to negative internet sources about the group. Asked by a cappella members to respond to the criticisms, NXIVM members reacted poorly. So Deke Sharon, who was not at the second festival, withdrew his support and most of the singing community followed his lead. Helmar 2020. In response, Claire Bronfman paid just under $900,000 US to a Canadian-based private detective agency, Canaprobe, to undertake covert banking investigations of perceived enemies, which included Sharon. In the Canaprobe report that Bronfman received, it stated that Sharon had offshore bank accounts, but it transpired that she had been scammed. According to an FBI agent, most, if not all, of the financial material was inaccurate. Because of the role of the private investigators in this story, and possibly also because an adult child, Bronfman, had been spying on her father, the blogger, Leo Helmar, that's me, who reported on NXIVM's use of Canaprobe, drew readers' attention to a recently published book by the father, Ron Miscavige, of Scientology's current leader, David Miscavige. Helmar informed readers that Ron, who was critical of his son David's behavior as Scientology's head, learned that his son had put him under surveillance. When it appeared incorrectly that Ron was having a heart attack, The private investigator phoned David, asking what to do. The son instructed the private investigator to let his father die and to not intervene. Helmar 2020, C. Miscavige with Kuhn 2016. Presenting Ron Miscavige's recent experience was important to the NXIVM story because NXIVM adapted many of the tactics which had been used by Scientology and its spy wing, which was initially known as the Guardian's Office and now has been rebranded as the Office of Special Affairs. Apparently I got that wrong. Helmar 2020 capitalization in original. And so it goes. This story. The story of how NXIVM failed to woo the a cappella crowd is so important to the saga, and there's so much more that I want to tell you about. There's so much more. It was as I was looking over the list of NXIVM's enemies as presented at Keith Raniere's trial that it really set in for me how utterly unique and strange this little story I'm going to tell you is. In a list full of reporters and senators, dignitaries and district attorneys and power brokers of all variety, judges and cult experts, there's a man named Deke Sharon on the enemies list of NXIVM. As revealed at trial, an a cappella singer and composer known as the father of modern contemporary a cappella. How did that guy get on Keith Raniere's enemies list? Well, what if I told you that NXIVM was crippled by a series of events that started in 2007 when an a cappella festival that NXIVM was hosting, all expenses paid, went horribly wrong. A message board thread was unearthed a few years ago that features a bunch of college a cappella singers, also members of the a cappella community like Deke Sharon, absolutely talking circles around a back-footed Keith Raniere, Allison Mack, Nikki Klein, Lauren Salzman, and Claire Bronfman, and yes, they're all in the thread, all posting at length, thousands of words. This thread is like a chunk of digital amber in a Jurassic Park forest of the internet. This little nugget of internet gold needs to be seen to be believed. It is so amazing. We're going to go over it in super detail in this series that we're doing on the NXIVM A Cappella Innovations Festival. So travel back with me to the mid-2000s, at the beginning of the era of the smartphone. Back in 2020, I wrote 2 Frank Report articles about it, which you can read. I'll link them in the description. And I always intended to return to the story because there's so much more to tell, and I just felt like I just wanted to really do it right, and it really needs to be told on video. It's one of the many reasons why I wanted to learn how to do YouTube stuff, because I had stories like this to tell. This is a story of how a ragtag group of a cappella enthusiasts struck a crushing blow against NXIVM. True to Keith Raniere's roots as an MLM pyramid Ponzi scheme guy, NXIVM was attempting to find its next affinity group. NXIVM was attempting to find its next affinity group or pool of new recruits. They had already mined the acting and yoga communities in Vancouver and New York State and elsewhere. Now Keith Raniere and his bevy of starlets and the purse of the Bronfmans and their hundreds of millions of dollars all offered an incredible array of weapons for a charm offensive, but something was different about the a cappella community, and Keith and his lieutenants had never encountered pushback like this, and besides, Keith had also been losing buckets of money as a day trader, and as a result, NXIVM cast their net out, looking for some help with PR. The help they got ended up being the help that they deserved.